Hello and a very warm welcome. Is India facing an imminent economic slowdown? You're watching the big India Today Economists Roundtable, and I'll be joined over the next 1 hour by some of the sharpest economic minds in this country. I want to introduce first Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor in the Government of India. With us on this broadcast, Sajid Chinoy, Chief India Economist, JP Morgan from Mumbai. With us also DK Joshi, Chief Economist, CRISIL. PC Mohanan has been in the news recently. He's the former acting chairperson of the National Statistical Commission. He opted out saying that the government is not releasing reports of data that they had collected. With me in the studio, Arun Kumar, economist and author, and Rajeev Dubey, managing editor of Business Today. Question number one on the Economists Roundtable: is India facing an imminent economic slowdown? Rajeev Dubey, I'll start with you. So there are multiple markers that have emerged over the last few weeks to suggest that we're heading towards an economic slowdown. Do you believe this to be true? And how strong a slowdown could this be?
Rahul, I do not just believe we are in, heading for a slowdown. We are actually in a slowdown. We've been in a slowdown for at least 3 quarters now. If you look at these quarterly numbers, and also if you look at the annual number, we've been in a decelerating, towards a slowdown since 15-16. So we are truly in a slowdown as of now. As I said when we discovered this about 2 weeks back, is that there are 4 engines in the economy, of which only 2 were working, which was public expenditure and consumption. And now that consumption itself has tanked, we are only on 1 engine of the economy, which also slowed down in the second half of the last fiscal.
Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, car sales have shrunk in the past 3 quarters. Fuel consumption is down to the lowest in 7 quarters. Power generation growth is the lowest in 5 years. Finished steel production is coming down. The industrial production index is at a 21-month low. GDP growth rate is coming down. Critics would suggest that India is in the middle of an economic slowdown and the government needs to emerge from its denial and accept the reality. How do you respond, sir?
So, if you keep in mind that a complex economy like ours, a lot of what you see today, these are effects of leads and lags that work out in the economy. I would like to point out that I think what we did acknowledge was that there was a slowdown in the fixed capital expenditure and the investment, and this itself happened because of some of the issues that we had in the build-up of excess capacity, which itself then creates has an effect on the demand side, because we have our corporates which are now still now have not reached 80% capacity. And also one important aspect that we should keep in mind is that an important structural reform like the bankruptcy code, which has an impact on the way in which we invest in the economy, the way in which actually credit is provided. It changes the credit culture. Some of these, there will be some temporary effects, but what I think we must keep in mind is that over the last 5 years there have been important structural reforms at the micro level and at the macro level. At the micro level, I just mentioned about the bankruptcy code. Also, we've been, we basically have taken care of some of the institutional plumbing or the governance plumbing that I talk about. For instance, to build capacity at the bottom of the pyramid, buying capacity, the fact that we've been using direct benefit transfers and we've done 6 lakh crores, 6 trillion rupees, out of which the savings is 1 trillion rupees itself. These are important micro level reforms. Together with that, when you combine and you take into account that inflation, which is a pernicious tax on the middle class and the bottom of the pyramid, which has indeed put purchasing power in the hands of the lower middle class and the middle class itself. When you put these together, you are looking at actually a situation where there is some effects of what has happened in the past, but I remain quite optimistic that going forward the effects of these will start showing up. Also, as I was mentioning, on the macro side, we've been following actually from the situation when we were in fiscal deficit, which was much higher, in excess of 5%. We've been following this path of fiscal prudence. We've been following the glide path, to meeting the FRBM targets. We also, if you look at the external sector, compared to when we were, for instance, in 2013, when we also were facing situations on both the fiscal and the external front, we actually are doing better.
So let's use that to build on this debate. The government will argue, Arun Kumar, that we're in the middle of a fundamental reset. Long-term structural reform has been implemented over the last 5 years. It is showing a temporary slowdown, but the advantages will start to accrue in the months and years to follow. Do you agree with the principal economic advisor?
No. The reason is that we have two parts of the economy, the unorganized sector and the organized sector. It's the unorganized sector that got hit very badly when we had demonetization and then GST. I think everybody agrees on that. The data for the unorganized sector comes with a time lag. So what effectively the GDP growth rate is based on the organized sector. If you include the unorganized sector, the economy is already slowing down from the time of demonetization, And therefore, in a sense, it's the demand problem that is very important, because 94% of the workforce is in the unorganized sector. If their incomes fall, then the demand for agriculture falls, and therefore the prices in agriculture go down. So our inflation rate being low is because of the deflation in the agricultural prices, which was causing a crisis in the farm sector. Also, if 94% of the employment is hit, then you have an employment crisis. And when such a large demand falls, then what happens is slowly it affects the organized sector also.
Heading towards a slowdown,
so we have been in a slowdown.
Of a full-blooded
So we have been in a slowdown, and now the organized sector is also slowing down, because automobiles, etc., are not bought by the unorganized sector.
So you're saying that post-demonetization, it's the unorganized sector that took a hit first.
Yes.
Now it's the organized sector where the data is suggesting that the slowdown has hit the organized sector as well. Sajid Chinoy, we've heard two contrarian points of view. Sitting where you are at JP Morgan, what's your view? Are we heading towards a slowdown? Are we in the middle of a slowdown? Or is this just a temporary blip before the economy takes off?
Good evening, Rahul. I think the data is quite clear that for a few months now we are in the midst of a slowdown. The reasons are not hard to see. We're being driven largely by consumption, and rural consumption was holding things up for a couple of years, but the terms of trade have moved very adversely against agriculture. Food prices have collapsed. Food inflation last year was less than 1%, whereas non-food inflation is above 5%. So from a farmer's perspective, the terms of trade was very adverse, and that's hurt rural consumption. What was holding consumption up was urban consumption. But ever since the NBFC shock and the ILFS shock last September, we've seen that the NBFC sector, which is 40% of the auto market, 40% of the housing market, has been hurt. And even though bank credit growth has picked up, the total flow of funds has come under some pressure. As a consequence, even urban consumption has been hit. So yes, there is some degree of stress, but I think we need to be careful here. Things are not as grave as some of the headline high-frequency data suggests, because there are some temporary and transient factors at play as well. I'll give you three. Number one, I think the government may have had to cut expenditure very sharply in the month of March to meet its fiscal deficit target. That has a knock-on impact on activity, but hopefully government spending normalizes when the new administration takes over. We've seen some of the surveys tell us that business investment sentiment has been affected because of political uncertainty, and that happens around the world before any election. So, if that uncertainty dissipates, in the next month or two, we should see sentiment pick up. And we're seeing idiosyncratic things, like in the auto sector, there's a transition to a new emissions norm, and that's pushed prices up and hurt demand. So both things are true. We're in the midst of some slowing. It's not as acute as the headline numbers would suggest, because there are some transient factors at play which should reverse or normalize in the coming months. But I'll end by saying one thing, and this was the point made earlier. So far India has been relying largely on two drivers, private consumption and government spending. We're seeing that there are limits to private consumption. we're seeing that given our consolidated fiscal deficit and our public investment needs, there really is not much space for government consumption. The singular focus, I think, of the next administration has to be one thing and one thing alone: revive private investment. We cannot have sustained 7% growth for the next few years without private investment, and that will take the next generation of both fiscal and financial reforms.
Okay, let Krishnamurthy Subramanian respond to that. One of the big failures of the Modi government of the past 5 years has been its inability on account of various factors to get private investment to kick off. We've still not fully utilized the capacities that were built. New investment hasn't come into play, and as a consequence, the moment consumption demand slows down, you're hit by a slowdown, and there's nothing that you can do about it. By the government's own revised GDP figures, economic growth, the GDP numbers are now down to 6.9% from 8.1% in 16-17, 7.2% in 17-18. Therefore, the government needs to accept that there is a slowdown. Is it because we're in the middle of an election, therefore you're not even willing to concede that the economy is indeed slowing down and there are real problems the new government needs to confront and deal with?
So, as Sajid was rightly pointing out, before any electoral cycle in any country, investors typically do adopt a wait and watch mode. Once this uncertainty resolves itself, there should be definite pickup in the investment, and as you yourself are pointing out, and as I was mentioning earlier, some of these slowdowns in the investment are also because of changes that we are bringing in the economy, which are necessary. For instance, implementing the bankruptcy code is something that is extremely important, because in order to be able to enhance the quality of credit that you bring, and that will definitely have some effect. Because remember, when you let's say in a regime when the bankruptcy code was not in operation, the capital budgeting need not have been as careful as it is now, because now corporates are faced with the prospect that if they do not get their capital budgeting projections right, they stand the risk of losing control of the company. Of course, anticipating that, therefore, they will be a lot more careful. What it will do then is that the quality of investment will go up. There will be some effect on the quantity. I think what we should make sure, there are a couple of aspects that I must point out to all market participants. We should not get consumed by the short run, number one. Number two, I think it is important not to get too driven by just what we see on the quantity. It is extremely critical also to look at the quality of the investments that are happening, and what are the structural changes that are happening in that. So keep that in mind. I think I would agree that the emphasis on investment is something that has to be placed, and I would also submit humbly that this has to bring in emphasis on some of the aspects of competitiveness that our industry also needs to focus on.
Okay, DK Joshi, do you agree with this wait and watch theory that from about the middle of March, India Inc. and everyone else has been in, let's wait and watch who's coming to power, then we'll take our decisions, and therefore the short-term numbers are looking bad because everyone's holding back all decisions till the 23rd of May. And once there is a government in place, then things will start returning to normalcy. Do you agree with this theory?
Well, I think at the very aggregate level, let me point out that there is slowdown in the economy, and it was visible a couple of months back when the GDP data for the third quarter pointed at 6.6% growth. And now, as far as the investment decisions are concerned, I think I would say that some factors have turned favorable for private investment. For instance, the companies have reduced their debt equity levels, which means that they can leverage going ahead. Also, I think we are seeing that the capacity utilization in some of the sectors have been consistently improving. So these are the positives, but I think I agree that the major headwind is the uncertainty, uncertainty is the biggest enemy of investment. And right now, even the business sentiment is low, as shown by the RBI survey. So I think, despite capacity utilization improving, I think the industry will wait for this political uncertainty to be over before they start investing. I may just add one more thing, that that the IBC process, the NCLT process, apart from changing the behavior of the market participants, I think what it also does is, I think it releases the excess capacity in the system, because when the companies acquire firms under NCLT, they will focus on improving their capacity utilization rather than, I think, investing in new capacity. So I think temporarily, I think it does slow down investment. I think this would particularly be visible in the steel sector. I think over the medium run, I think there would be challenges of jobs, there will be challenges of inequality, but clearly I think three factors are turning positive, and they will play out over the medium run. One is that we will get some reform dividend. Until now, I think the GST process has been more of a headwind because it's getting streamlined. I think it will start paying off once I think the process is streamlined.
Okay,
and
Arun Kumar,
also
reform
deleveraging, as I
dividend,
mentioned,
that
I think
you've
once the
bitten
firms start
tough,
leveraging, I think
bitter
we'll see
pellets. At some point in time in the near future, these bitter reforms will start yielding results.
So I'll make 2 points. One quick point is that investment doesn't suddenly take off. You know, when there's uncertainty, it leads to long term. So there's a time lag process. So what we're talking about is only the organized sector. We're not talking about the unorganized sector. And what GST has done is hurt the unorganized sector, even though it has been exempt from GST, you know, up to 40 lakh and up to 1.5 crore composition scheme. But they don't get input credit. They cannot give input credit. They are stuck with the reverse charge mechanism. So GST is faulty in design, not just in implementation. So we've had more than 700 changes, orders, etc. coming in the last 22 months. But I would say that even if that gets sorted out, the unorganized sector is unambiguously getting hit. For instance, you take a look at the pressure cooker industry. There, the chief of the pressure cooker industry said the demand is shifted from the unorganized sector to us. You look at the recent story from the shoe industry, and there also there are large number of small producers. Demand is shifting from them to the organized sector because they are the ones who are able to deal with GST. They get the input credit. The small guy doesn't get the input credit. So therefore, these structural problems are going to continue. And that's why my argument is investment takes time to revive. So if there's uncertainty and because of that investment is down, it's not just in March. It was already slowing down.
Okay.
And that's why and that will continue even after the new government takes place.
I'll just like to add one thing, that we are still decelerating. We haven't hit the bottom as yet. The second thing is that exports are not going to go up because there's a new government in power in the center, nor are private investments going to come up unless capacity utilization is improving, nor are people going to start buying just because there's a new government in power. So like Dr. Kumar is saying, there is a structural problem that we need to resolve. These things are going to take their own time to resolve.
Okay, so that brings me now to question number 2. Is it global factors or policies of the Modi government that are responsible for the economic slowdown? Let me put that question first to Dr. Subramanian, because if I see just as one metric, agricultural growth, we now have data to compare the performance of UPA2 with that of NDA2, and between 2009 to 2013-14, agricultural growth rate was 4.3%. That has now come down from 2014 to 2019 to an average of 2.9%. The likes of Mr. Chidambaram, Pranab Mukherjee and others in the UPA would argue that they did, even in UPA2, a better job than NDA2 when it comes to agricultural growth. Dr. Subramanian.
So let me first respond to your question on agriculture. I think all of us would actually be missing the point if we start comparing these numbers, because the issue actually is elsewhere. The key problem is, we've been focused so much on enhancing production, and we've done that. So we have a food economy which is, where the food production is growing at more than 3%, and we have a population that is growing at less than 1%. As a result, you have surplus. So the key aspect that has to be focused on is it's not the food production as much, but the marketing of the food produced, bringing markets to the consumer, to the producer in this case, which is the farmer. And that is where, if you look at the ENAM, and I do concede that there are improvements which are being worked on, but it's an attempt, to really bring markets. The problem has actually been, has been identified, and there's work that is going on in trying to bring that. The second aspect, there's a lot of research that shows that agriculture itself, if you what we financial economists think about as the risk-return trade-off in agriculture is quite adverse. The farmers, face a lot of risks, and especially downside risks, or what we call left-tailed risks. Here's where I think some of the support that is being given, for instance, through the PM Kisan, because research here shows that when you take care of the downside risks that farmers face, that crowds in productive investment in the form of fertilizers, in the form of other inputs that go in, and thereby enhances productivity. Also remember that because the risk is so huge, you have to actually focus on making sure that the downside is taken care of. So we have to really work on, in the agriculture side, bring in a lot more technology, because we really have, as one of the earlier economic surveys had talked about, we have not 20, not 100, but we have several tens of thousands of agricultural markets which are not integrated with each other. As a result, the farmer actually is it doesn't have enough options.
No, but all
except
of this
basically go to the
was
local
also
mandi.
the case.
This is what we have to actually focus on. I think
when the BJP promised in 2013, 2014 that it would double farm income by 2022, a promise that's now not being spoken of at all. It's almost as if that promise was never made. Now the question is, and Dr. Krishnamurthy is right when he says that there are structural problems. Just generating farm output is not enough. You have to take it to the consumer. The farmer has to have better mechanisms. All that may be true, but this is a promise that was made when you went to the voters in the last election, and therefore the government will be held accountable when data suggests that promise is not being kept. Sajid Chinoy.
Rahul, let me take your larger question actually about a more holistic assessment of the last few years, which is how much of this is global, how much of this is domestic. I think it's a bit of both. I think let's just put this in perspective. When the economy was growing around 9% between 2004 and 2009, exports grew at 18% a year in real terms for 5 successive years. The last 5 years, exports have grown at 4%. So given the share of exports in the economy, that slowdown itself is responsible for a couple of percentage points of headline GDP growth slowing. So the government has faced a rather adverse global economy, offset in part by the fact that oil prices are down, and that's provided some fillip to growth in India. There have also been domestic reasons. I agree with Dr. Subramanian here that when you do big structural reform, that the deleveraging in the banking system that's been underway in the last few years, cleaning up our public sector banks, asset resolution, these do extract short-term growth impacts, and we've seen that it's only last year that credit growth has actually picked up, similarly with the GST. So I think it's a combination of a slightly more hostile global environment, the fact that reforms have happened here which are dislocational. But Rahul, to your point, on agriculture, I think it's more important to look forward and accept the following fact, that given productivity levels in agriculture, we will have to emulate what China did. I don't think these problems can be fixed by higher support prices or doubling incomes, because A, that's economically not very viable, and B, would be very inflationary if that income growth does not keep up with productivity growth. So in a way, what we're saying is we have to dramatically improve productivity growth rates in agriculture, which are not economically feasible. We've seen around the world. What we need to do is create a demand push for jobs outside agriculture, in industry, in services that are labor intensive, so that people can gradually migrate from lower productivity agricultural jobs to slightly higher productivity, both formal and informal jobs in industry and services. I think that has to be the game plan.